Officer O'Neill pulled on the standard TCBD armoured gloves, biting the gauntlet tightly and pulling it firmly into place. Tonight, he followed procedure to the letter. He glanced over at the driver of the armoured vehicle. His name was Brown, a large, seemingly fearless man in his late 20s. Officers Brown and O'Neill had been deployed on countless assignments together. Heck, they were partners in all but name, and between them had seen more on this earth than was ever dreamt of in heaven or hell. The armoured vehicle bounced over the empty streets, the freezing February rain pushed aside by the relentless back and forth of the wipers. Both men sat in silence. TCBD stood for Tactical Carnivorous Body Disposal Unit, and these vehicles had become a common sight on the roads ever since the end of the war only 3 short years ago. Although hostilities had officially ended on all 6 continents, there was still the seemingly endless task of the biological cleanup. And after all, not every reanimated corpse had met with the barrel or the blade. The country was littered with zombies in various states of decomposition, ambling viciously through moors or country parks, shambling down disused railway lines or wading through city sewers. On the bright side, the stragglers' numbers were small. Latest estimates had run from between 1,500 and 5,000 remaining in Great Britain, and the TCBD call-outs were gradually beginning to dwindle. Officer Brown secured his helmet with a traditional double tap on the temple, and turned to O'Neill. "So, what's tonight?" he asked absently. Brown turned to answer. "Didn't you read the slip?" O'Neill ignored the question. Brown continued. "Cemetery order. 1, possibly 2 plots. Guy on the estate said he couldn't be sure, but we've got the location." O'Neill stared deeply into the oncoming rain and the dark streets, seeing nothing, but thinking all the time. "Gonna be a filthy job in this downpour," said Brown. "A nightmare," added O'Neill quietly. Both men were veterans of the zombie war. They had battled the living dead in city, forest, and even desert. They were both decorated war heroes, with hundreds of zombies dispatched with ease. However, nothing they had seen as soldiers could prepare them for the psychological toll the slow disposal sweep of the remaining dead would have on them, especially when it came to assignments like tonight. When the noise of the war had ceased and social order was restored to the districts, the quiet nights were too often broken by the muffled cries of the recently buried dead. The term recently in the case of the undead could mean anything from 1 day to 6 years, depending on the condition of the corpse and the buried bodies. Embalmed bodies, for that matter, could sometimes still writhe for up to 10 years after death. The armoured vehicle screeched round the corner and came to a stop next to a high fence topped with 2 layers of razor wire. Behind it lay a dark expanse the pale streetlights could not penetrate. "Here we are," said Brown with a sigh. O'Neill stared forward for several beats, before finally turning towards the cemetery perimeter. He stared intensely into the darkness. He could just make out the curved tops of the ancient headstones. The sight of them sitting there at the edge of his vision made an icy chill cling to his back like cold, wet autumn leaves. The bolt cutters made an almost deafening snap and clang in the empty streets. To their surprise, the rain had stopped abruptly as they climbed out of the van. A welcome but unexpected turn of events. As Brown worked, O'Neill looked up to see a small shaft of light appear behind a curtain in one of the houses on the edge of the estate. Concerned citizens were now used to such patrols, and after a few seconds, the light faded and the 2 men worked alone once more. Brown opened the bolt cutters and pulled the chain out of the gate in one clean movement. The gate swung silently open, and after sharing a nod and a deep breath, they filed quietly inside. "Light up," whispered O'Neill. Both men's hands moved silently to the sides of their tactical helmets and switched on the built-in headlamps. They both adjusted the flashlights, widening the beams simultaneously. They assessed their surroundings. They had entered the graveyard through the main gate, and it was instantly clear to both soldiers that the headstones in this area were all amongst the oldest plotted here. Brown turned his head to illuminate the headstone closest to them. The name was long eroded, but he could make out the date. "Year of our Lord, 1888, it read. Brown had produced a portable GPS tablet and was studying it intensely. After a few moments, the large man started walking and gestured to his comrade to follow. Both men plodded off quietly into the darkness. Although Brown led the way, O'Neill knew too well where they were going. They walked silently over the overgrown wet grass, weaving between the seemingly endless grave markers, Brown glancing down occasionally at the rain-soaked screen. They were still minutes away from the indicator pin. "This reminds me," began Brown, pausing to check the screen again, "of those night sweeps in France," he continued, "when all we wanted to do was steal a dinghy and make it back across the channel," replied O'Neill with a reminiscent smirk. "Oh yeah," said Brown, glad of the levity. It made the darkness less oppressive. "With Seymour." "Seymour!" Brown shouted into the night, his voice reverberating in a muffled echo across the graves. O'Neill jumped a little at this, shooting Brown a concerned look. The big man didn't notice. "Mad bastard. Great soldier, though. Dealt with some of the most disgusting dead I've ever seen, completely unfazed. This one time there was this fat fucking ghoul hanging halfway out of a ground floor window. His guts were spilt—" "Wait a minute," Brown interrupted himself. The tablet had begun to flash, a silent strobe from an embedded LED. This meant they were within 10 meters of their pin. O'Neill could see the fence again. They had walked nearly the entire width of the cemetery. The graves on this side were much more recently dug. He reached out and stroked the top of one, disturbing the beads of rain on its black, shiny granite surface. Then they continued forward in silence. Brown spoke first and pointed to a dimly lit house on the estate that bordered the cemetery on 3 of its sides. "That's the house that called in the complaint." O'Neill looked to see where Brown was pointing. He nodded in agreement. "Must be one of these, then." "Wait, listen," whispered Brown. Both men stood perfectly still. The sound of the rain became dominant. At once, they both heard it. At first it was almost imperceptible, a muffled scraping mixed with a weak, thudding sound. Just then, an impossible cry emanated from the bowels of the earth beneath. It could be described as a cross between an infant's cry of deepest anguish, mixed with an urban fox's midnight shriek. It was a sound that the men had heard before, but never failed to raise the gooseflesh on their necks. They had reached their target. In unison, both men pulled out their entrenching tools from the side of their combat belts. Each flipped up the shovel heads on the end. The sharp stainless steel glinted in the light of their headlamps. "Let's dig," both men whispered in unison. Brown smiled and began to rip chunks of earth from the grave. He glanced up from his work. O'Neill seemed to hesitate and then joined him vigorously, pushing his shovel into the rain-softened grass and mechanically stacking the soil in a neat pile on the right side of the grave, as they had done many, many nights before. "Speaking of Seymour," began Brown. "What about that joker?" O'Neill questioned absently, and continued plunging his spade effortlessly into the mud and earth. The noises from below had ceased abruptly when the men began to dig. "He killed a prophet once," said Brown. O'Neill planted his spade and let out an unnervingly loud laugh that echoed even in the rain. "Prophets aren't real, man," he scoffed, and began to dig again. "I know what you think, man, but Seymour saw one of these fuckers speak. He told me last week. We were having a sesh and he was asking me about the most rotten dead I'd seen, still, alive. I told him about the sweep of the mass grave in Belgium, and that skeleton priest we saw. Then he told me his story. Remember when they were deployed on the East Front that summer? Well, he said one night, him and one of the French guards were on patrol when they came across a real mess. 2 van loads of bodies that had run off the road and collided, making a 6-ton roadblock. They opened the back of one of the vans and found the problem was one of the bodies was alive and had torn the driver apart. The thing was, though, when they took aim to fire, the thing just sat there and stared at them, his tongue lolling, lapping the blood around its mouth. Then it turned to the French guard and—" Brown halted abruptly as a hollow thud emanated from beneath them. His spade had struck the lid of the wooden coffin. Both men looked at each other in silent confirmation. They worked together to clear the remaining mud from the lid of the dark wooden coffin. Short the usual layers of filth and mould that inevitably accumulated, the structure was still completely intact. When they had finished digging a shallow moat around the coffin, both men threw their shovels clear of the grave and began to climb out. The edges of the rectangular excavation had begun to erode in the rain. It took all their effort to climb free without sliding back into the trench. When they rose fully, Brown reached into a pouch in his leg armour and removed a long metal hook on the end of a steel rod. He released a catch on the side of the padded handle, and the pole extended to a length of about 5 feet. He stood firmly and began lowering it into the darkness of the grave. O'Neill stood fast on the opposite side and watched the operation unflinchingly. "Get that cherry ready," Brown ordered. Obediently, O'Neill unzipped a small pocket on the front of his body armor chest plate and extracted a small spherical metal object the size of a ping-pong ball. Its shining chrome surface was intersected by lines which formed rows of indented cubes, much like those on a miniature pineapple grenade. His thumb began to probe for the small primer button. Once compressed, this would ignite the delay element, and in 5 to 6 seconds, the high concentration of RDX inside would explode with enough force to disintegrate any object within a 2-foot radius, an object like a human skull, and the brain within. "Almost got it," spat Brown through clenched teeth. "Now!" he yelled and yanked the hook up and out of the grave. With it flew open the coffin lid, on its rusted metal hinges. It crashed loudly against the grave wall and shattered down the middle, and then it fell with a splash into the pool of muddied rainwater which had now accumulated around the coffin. A moat of filth. Both men wiped the rainwater from their eyes to better see the ferocious creature they had unearthed. To their surprise, the body of the woman in her once white burial dress, now blackened with years of accumulated mould and moss, was laying perfectly still. Her parched, leathery hands crossed elegantly upon her sunken chest. Her hair, eerily undecayed, was still neatly bound in a bun that framed her hideously skeletal face. The skin of her lips and soft tissue of the gums had long since receded, exposing her yellowed teeth. This gave the chilling effect of a feral snarl. Brown relaxed and turned to O'Neill. "We both heard it. Better be safe." He nodded at the tiny sphere O'Neill held tight in his fist. O'Neill turned to meet his gaze. "Cover distance," he ordered solemnly. Brown probed his partner's eyes, which had turned suddenly cold. Concerned, he was about to check in, but when O'Neill lowered his head back down towards the grave, Brown decided it could wait. His body yearned for this night to be over. The cold and driving rain had begun to penetrate through his armor, and the weight of death through his mind. Brown turned and jogged the 10 feet away. He gave O'Neill a thumbs up and crouched on one knee in the mud. O'Neill examined his target. The grave, now so waterlogged some of the mud had begun to run into the coffin. Black veins of filth slowly crept down its white silk lining. Brown watched his partner quizzically from his post, and then convulsively flinched as he heard the sharp click. O'Neill had compressed the primer button on the cherry, and now held it ceremoniously over the lip of the grave, his arm outstretched and head down, as if in prayer. After a beat, O'Neill raised his head, letting his face be washed by the sky. Warm tears began to mix with the cold, unsympathetic blood of the cosmos. "I'm sorry, Mum," he cried to no one, and dropped the cherry. Brown stood up instantly, but it took his brain a few beats to fully comprehend what he'd heard. He tried to yell to O'Neill to stand away, but in his panic and the driving rain, the words were lost. O'Neill watched the shining cherry tumble towards his mother's skull. He begged for an end to this abomination, an end to the humiliation of her soul. He had to be the one to do it. He could not let any one of his brutish comrades murder his mother on this night. He had to be the one. It happened with lightning rapidity. The creature that had once given him life opened its eyes, and with inhuman reflex grabbed the cherry out of the air. O'Neill could hear the dry sinews and bones of the creature's withered arms and hands, snapping with the effort of the explosive movement. Its 5 bony fingers wrapped around the grenade, and flung it with force across the trench where it plopped harmlessly into the thick mud that now submerged its feet. Brown, who had now begun to sprint towards his friend, threw an arm defensively over his eyes. As he did so, a plume of mud exploded from the grave and rained down on both men. When the explosion had stopped ringing in their ears, and the steam and smoke had subsided, O'Neill leant over the grave once more, his face contorted with anguish. To his bewilderment, the creature stared back at him, unharmed by the explosion that had no doubt rocked the city streets for miles. O'Neill shivered with vile repulsion as he stared into the creature's eyes. 2 rotten egg whites sloshing clumsily from side to side in a sightless skull. Sightless, but all-seeing. "Darling," rasped the creature impossibly through a withered throat. "No! Mum, no!" O'Neill begged the universe. "Help me," it wailed, raising its stick-like arms towards him. It was his mother's voice, thought O'Neill through his paralysis. It was the voice that had once soothed and disciplined in equal measure, the voice that had shaped him, but it held no warmth now. Still, he felt an overwhelming pity and hope. Brown sprinted the short distance and arrived at his partner's side. He peered down. "Good God!" said Brown with a mix of awe and revulsion, burning acid rising from his gut as he stared into those hollow sockets. O'Neill turned and grabbed Brown by his vest with both his hands. "We have to help her," he begged like a child. "Rick, you've got to help me. We've got to help her out. It's my mother. She's alive." He was shaking Brown uncontrollably. If he could only make him believe it, then maybe he would too. Brown ignored his friend's cries, and a pitying look came over his eyes. "O'Neill," he said with a measured tone, "that thing down there is not your mother." O'Neill followed the path of Brown's hand, as he lowered it to his side and gently unclasped the safety strap that held his sidearm in place. Both men looked at each other as the creature continued to scream from its tomb. The coffin was almost completely filled with mud now, and the creature's legs were partly submerged. Brown drew his sidearm with swift professionalism and pointed it at the creature's head. O'Neill's eyes suddenly turned cold, with a look of wolf-like savagery. "Don't! You can't!" O'Neill demanded, his eyes swollen with grief and anger. He, in turn, unclasped the safety catch on his holster and drew his weapon. Brown fired, but the gun only produced a muffled click. The rain had run into the bullet chamber, stopping the firing pin making sufficient friction to ignite the charge in the round. O'Neill fired his weapon. The bright muzzle flash illuminated the glistening lining of his skull, as a quarter of his head was ripped away on impact. The large man was dead before he hit the mud. O'Neill stood with the smoking gun pointed into blank space. All was quiet. "Good boy," the creature growled in a mocking tone. O'Neill slowly turned to see the thing that was once his mother standing upright in the grave, ankle-deep in filth. The white burial dress clung to its bones, an obscene angel. It raised its head, but as it did so, what remained of its eyeballs dribbled out of the side of its sockets and began to fill with rainwater. O'Neill vomited. Dropping his still-smoking sidearm down into the grave, it quickly sank into the mud. The creature walked to the near end of the grave and began to climb the wall of the soft earth like an inhuman spider. As it climbed, it spoke. "Very impressive display of power, my boy. Killing your only friend and confidant. Oh, yes. You'll have no one else to share your pitiful stories of woe with now, will you? Your stories of lust and animal aggression. Your stories of defilement on foreign shores that you pathetically justify to yourself and to each other. Oh, yes. You're alone with your demons now, my brave little soldier." It threw back its head and cackled, displaying all of its yellowed teeth. O'Neill was nearly catatonic with a nightmare sense of unreality. He stared at the creature as it climbed ever closer. No, he whimpered. I wouldn't. "Oh, that poor girl. Poor French pup. She begged you for help and you did nothing as your comrades ravaged her like wild dogs. Who's going to notice another cadaver in the town square bonfire tomorrow, you told yourself, while that girl screamed for her mother. Her dead mother, boy. Her dead mother!" O'Neill could only shake his head. Flecks of vomit fell from his chin. "He sees everything, my angel, and he wants you to see too." It was upon him. One bony hand gripped his ankle like an iron vice. The strength was extraordinary. Using his body armor for purchase, it quickly scaled his frozen form. It hugged him tight and caressed the back of his neck. A mother's embrace. O'Neill could only smell death now. The creature's lank hair fell on his shoulders and brushed his cheek. It loosened its hold and gently cupped his chin in its putrid hand. O'Neill stared deep into empty sockets. He was faintly aware of 3 sharp clicks as the creature reached into his armor and depressed the primer buttons on the remaining cherries. "Come and see, my boy. Come and see." It embraced him once more. O'Neill shut his eyes and suddenly, the world turned to fire.